As many of you know, a number of provinces have developed strategies that relate to disability and work. Some more focused, some broader strategies, and we thought it would be useful context for the discussion for the development of the strategy document to have an understanding of some of the provincial strategies that have been developed. And so we're very pleased to have as chair of this session Mary Reid, who recently retired as the Director for the Disability Policy Office for the Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm going to turn this over without further ado to Mary. Thank you, Mary.
Super. Thank you, Ron. Yes, I am recently retired. I have to tell you that retirement is very good. It is worth waiting for. Nothing wrong with it. Prior to being with the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, I did work with the City of Ottawa as accessibility specialist. But really, my knowledge base comes from working with the community in an independent living resource center for over 25 years. And that's where I really had a wonderful, good fortune to learn from people who are consumers, who have lived experience, because really they are problem solvers extraordinaire and experts in creating and knowing what makes an inclusive environment. I'm delighted to be chairing this panel, absolutely, and I look forward to the presentations and the discussion. This panel is going to offer you learnings from a provincial perspective, and it will add to the ensuing conversation and discussions about the draft Disability and Work in Canada strategy. So you've received an overview of this strategy. I'm going to take a moment just to highlight again that vision, which is about inclusive workplaces, inclusive employment, and that people would have the same choices and opportunities in regards to jobs, work, careers. And the 4 pillars, those being the disability confident and inclusive workplaces, comprehensive supports, effective partnerships, and good monitoring, measurement, and accountability. You also heard about some of the proposed initiatives to get going. So I'm going to ask you to keep those in mind as you're hearing from provincial perspectives, because that will be part of our discussion afterwards. So think about this. Also, you've gotten a short bio of all the panelists in your agenda, so I'm not going to do more introduction than just name and title, but do look at the bios, because they're certainly interesting, and we do have an expert group here at the table. The panelists are going to share high-level information about strategies from their province, but they're going to focus in on the employment aspect. Their task is to share some of the successes and the challenges of implementation, the indicators that they use to measure progress. We're also going to ask them to give advice in terms of the draft Disability and Work in Canada strategy. So their challenge is to do this in 5-6 minutes. Yeah. Following the presentations of the panelists, they'll have a short discussion, and then we'll open to you and ask for your comments and ideas and questions. So I'll introduce the panelists. We're going to start from the west, and I'm going to introduce all at once, and then we'll just go presentation to presentation. The first panelist is Ian Ross, to my far left, and Ian is the Executive Director of Policy and Program Development with the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction in the Government of British Columbia. Next, we'll hear from Jennifer Clark, to my immediate left. And Jennifer is the Director of Program Effectiveness, Disability Programs with the Government of Saskatchewan. Next, we're going to hear from Anne McGraw, who is sitting between the 2 panelists. And Anne McRae, sorry. Anne is the Manager of Employment Supports, persons with disabilities with the Government of Nova Scotia. That's not the role I know Anne in, so I'm having trouble with that. Then we're going to hear from Henry Kiley. Henry is from Newfoundland and Labrador, Director of the Disability Policy Office. And finally, we'll hear from Brian Saunders. Brian is a Senior Policy Analyst with the New Brunswick Premier's Council on Disabilities. Both Brian and Henry are joining us remotely, and you can see them on the screen. They're not able to see you, but they can see me, so I can keep them on time. Starting with Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'll just start off by saying that I have a sort of a perspective on this work where in my current role, I'm responsible for program and policy development for employment programs. But I've also been the executive director responsible for social assistance, and I've also worked in that role with what is called the Accessibility Secretariat in British Columbia. And I'm going to focus on some of the work that team has done around what started off being called Accessibility 2024. It is now called Accessible BC, and it's our 12-point building block plan to make BC a truly accessible province. Like a lot of this work, it began as an evolution, and really in around 2012 or so, the seeds of doing a broad-based provincial consultation with the disability community began to happen. And through 2013, we conducted a province-wide consultation process where we visited a number of communities with face-to-face sessions. We also had an online consultation process as part of that as well. We established a sort of a steering group of community and government to guide the process and to inform the What We Heard report that came out of that, as well as the formation of a strategy which was released in 2014. And as I mentioned, there's 12 building blocks in that strategy, and employment is one of them. But I would say that being a broad-based accessibility strategy, employment is really threaded through the entire document, and there's other building blocks that are quite relevant to employment. Accessible service delivery has a component around what the province does for its workforce, and it was really great to hear Deputy Minister LaRoche this morning talking about what the Federal Civil Service is doing on that front, and I think they've leapfrogged quite a bit, honestly, and that's really exciting to see. Also, income support, which I know we'll talk about, and certainly the draft strategy references supports, and financial security as well. So these are all focus areas that have embedded in the BC strategy. So it's been as a strategy, it's relatively straightforward. It's got a truly accessible province is the vision, and then there's the 12 building blocks, and annual reporting flows through on an annual basis on progress. The measure that we initially picked for employment was the employment rate, which is first and foremost in this strategy. So of course we're supportive of that. But as everyone in this room knows, having a consistent data set for disability has been a challenge over the number of years, and it's really important, I think, we move forward with a consistent data set that we can measure progress over time with. So I'll just go through some highlights from the last few years of what we've done, and they touch on a lot of points in the draft strategy. So we established a president's group of employers who are putting forward accessible employment as their fundamental reason for being, and I'd say it took about 3 years for them to get into a place where they launched an initiative, and now we have just in the last 2 months launched a accessibleemployers.ca portal where employers in BC can register and receive information about becoming disability confident. We established September as Disability Employment Month. So engagement's a key theme you'll see in the BC strategy, where throughout the 84 work centers that we have in BC, we have sessions, information sessions, and job fairs and employer fairs on hiring people with disabilities. We established a Technology at Work program, which provides employees and employers with access to technology and training to use the technology. We established an internship program, and that's been quite successful. About 66% of the participants of that have gone on to get permanent full-time employment in the BC Public Service. We really want to make sure that we have an accessible civil service. I just saw the 2-minute warning there, so I'm going to speed up. A big policy piece, and I'll talk a little bit about this through our broader conversation, was we introduced an annual earnings exemption for people with disabilities on social assistance. So fundamentally changed, and I see Pat Danforth there giving us a bit of a shout out that was something we did in partnership with the disability community. And so Two key successes from our strategy, I'd say, that are relevant to this work here is partnership and engagement, absolutely. Involving people with disabilities at the center, their advocates as well, is really important. Employers is the second sort of key group that really need to be engaged through this process. They need to feel that confidence that comes with being an accessible employer. Thinking about advice and comments on the draft strategy, I think it's, my first reaction is that the four pillars are the right area to start. I was really glad to hear the comment about the interconnectedness between those pillars, because none of those things exist on their own. I would say that from the BC experience, again, the partnership and engagement is fundamental to all this. Starting a social change with employers is really important. I'd say that there's some other considerations that we need to take into that I'm sure will arise over the next 2 days. The first one that I see is around engaging with the Indigenous community. I can see Neil Belanger from the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Societies here, and BC has a commitment to the UN DRIP and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and I think that needs to be threaded into this work somehow. There was also a mention around youth. There's a lot of really promising activities going on for youth with disabilities right now. And I'd also say just two other comments. There was noted about the small business in Canada. We also need to think about distance and what it's like to get employment in a rural community, especially when there's hundreds of kilometers between the nearest center. And then the last I'd mention would be to put a bit of a gender-based analysis as well into the work, because I think that really we'll see different outcomes based on gender and on also. So those are just my initial ideas, and I think I'm at about 6 minutes precisely. All right.
Well done. Well done. Extra points. Thank you very much, Ian. Jennifer.
All right. It's always tough to go second when you've got a province who actually was one of the people that you modeled your strategy after. So there's a lot of similarities between what Ian said and what's going on in Saskatchewan. They're a little bit ahead of us. So they're seeing some, I think, earlier successes as we continue to sort of plug through the process of implementation. Before I get into the employment-specific components of our strategy, as I mentioned, we do have a broad-based strategy as well in Saskatchewan, but I wanted to give you some of the sort of foundational pieces that I think are really important and sort of threaded throughout the discussions that you're having today and tomorrow. First, we had a very I would say, extensive and inclusive multi-method process for engagement. Again, we used something similar to what BC did. We were out in communities, we were talking to folks, we had a citizen consultation group, that 15-member panel who actually wrote the strategy with us. And so I think that was really helpful in helping us land where we did. Our strategy itself contains 12 recommendations, similar to BC, with sub-recommendations that are organized under 6 outcome areas. And we have a number of where to start actions, because we really thought it was important to provide clear examples on what people could start doing today. We didn't want them to have to imagine what these recommendations actually meant. The strategy is intended as a 10-year comprehensive approach that sets out the vision to change the experience of disability in our province. And that actually relates to our title, which is People Before Systems, Transforming the Experience of Disability. And really, that's been foundational for us as we've been going through. And so we're finding that education and promotion is a really big part of what we're doing, just in trying to get the community uptake and stakeholders to really embrace this new concept of disability that we're trying to promote. And for us, the discussion about the experience of disability is really empowering, because when we take an impact-based approach, and this is what our strategy is sort of founded on, is moving away from the medical model of disability, because it suggests that there's something wrong with the person and that our system responses then try to fix them. When we switch it around to focus on impact of disability, we reflect on the dynamic interaction between the individual and their situation or their environment. And to me, that has been, and I think the message we're trying to put out, is that's a lot more empowering because we actually can do something about the environment, the policies, the situation around which people are part of. And so then we can actually start to own more of the supports and engagement around making things better for folks with disabilities. And so that's really where our focus has been. So our strategy is sort of founded on 4 transformational drivers. And these are kind of the horizontal concepts that are pushing the whole thing. So we've got person-centered services, impact of disability, promoting and protecting human rights, and recognizing that accessibility and inclusion benefit us all. And so over the last couple of years, since we've released, we've really been trying to push those concepts. We've had some success with the Public Service Commission, just launching a disability awareness module that is mandatory, well, almost mandatory. It's strongly encouraged for all of our public service staff. We're working on an educational promotional launch kind of thing that we're hoping to get out early in the new year, using some more creative tools. Well, at least maybe, there's probably some pretty creative folks in the room, so I'll say creative for government. We're trying to do some TED Talks and using more video and ways of trying to actually meet people where they're at in terms of giving them useful and interesting information as opposed to a more bureaucratic lens. Another kind of cool thing that we're working on is a draft framework around outcomes. So I was really encouraged to see the outcomes framework mentioned, as that's really what we've tried to do and it's not launched yet, but in sort of the final stages, where we took what was in the 12 strategy recommendations and we've turned it into an outcomes framework. So 8 key outcome areas, so that we can actually start to measure progress. So the strategy recommendations were really useful for telling the story of what we heard through the consultation process and the types of actions that we need to do. But in terms of measuring progress, we really want to focus on what are we achieving, so that we're not just doing a checkbox of, yes, I've done this, well, how well? How has it improved things? And that's really the direction we're trying to go. I'll just touch on some of the specific actions that I saw alignment with the Pan-Canadian strategy. So disability confident, and I have to say I love that term, and inclusive workplaces. And this is really the same types of things that we've got in our recommendation 6 in the strategy. So inclusion in the economy, focus on not just the supports for the individual, but also supports for employers. And I think that is going to be really key, is those partnerships and helping employers to actually recognize their role. The comprehensive supports. We've got a lot going on in this area. My area of work right now is actually the community living area, and so focused on individuals with intellectual disabilities. And we're doing lots in that area around evolving our day programming to be more supported employment type opportunities, inclusion, other ways to be out in the community. Our income assistance program, if you're not familiar with it, recently split, and we have a program called the Saskatchewan Short Income for Disabilities program, so SED, and this is actually for people with significant and enduring disabilities, and it is impact-based. So again, drawing on the theme around eligibility being more clear and consistent. Partnerships, reinforce those, and then the measurement and accountability. So I've kind of blended, hopefully, some of the successes. There's a couple I wanted to touch on, but I have no time, so hopefully they will come out in the questions. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
I'm going to have to talk really fast, aren't I? It's a pleasure to be here. I am a bit different in that I come from Nova Scotia, where we don't actually have an employment strategy per se, but we have recently passed accessibility legislation, and in that, of course, there will be standard development, and one of the standards will be around employment. And the first two that we're going to tackle are the built environment and education, which also have an impact on employment for sure. And also, the job that I have right now is I'm the manager of employment supports for persons with disabilities. And in that role, I've been asked to create a framework around improving employment outcomes for people with disabilities. And so the work that's being done here is truly very timely, and I'm really excited to have been given the opportunity to be here today. And we'll be certainly hoping to work with this information as I go forward. As I said, the accessibility legislation was passed in 2017, and there's a commitment to a more equitable and barrier-free province of Nova Scotia by 2030. We have put out two action plans, one that's sort of for the province of Nova Scotia, and then the other is actually for the government of Nova Scotia. And with respect to employment, the standards that will be created will support persons with disabilities in finding meaningful employment, and the goal is to ensure equal access to employment for persons with disabilities. And in the action plan that's going to be for the province as a whole, one of the key outcomes is equitable access to employment for persons with disabilities. In addition, several actions relate specifically to the employment of persons with disabilities, and an example is that they will be assessing existing programs that provide support for the hiring, training, accommodation, and advancement of persons with disabilities in the workplace, and to identify opportunities to improve them. So that's what's going to be happening over the next few years as we move towards implementing an employment standard. But I want to highlight a couple of other things that are going on that are relevant to the work that you're doing here today. The government announced a little over a year ago $10 million for a program called NOW, New Opportunities for Employment, and it's geared towards ensuring that those individuals who are from underrepresented groups, and that includes people with disabilities, would have access to wage subsidies that were going to be of a 2-year duration. And they have provided over 181 individuals with employment with over 100 employers, and 25% of those individuals are people with disabilities. And the really interesting thing about this particular project is that there's a heavy component where mandatory training for employers is built into the program. The supports that are being provided for all the individuals that are taking part in this program are very flexible and all-encompassing, so whatever the individual needs, they're being provided with. And they will have the opportunity to work for an employer for 2 years. And they also had to ensure that their, how to phrase this, they wanted to ensure that that by the end of that 2 years, that the relationship was solidified, and that the jobs that they were placed in were vacancies. These were not jobs that they just sort of made up. They had to be vacancies that the employers had. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the results of that program is going to be. We're really excited about it. We also have Disability Confident Employer Network that's doing a lot of work employing and working with employers to ensure that they have the tools that they need to be disability confident. And we're also doing work similar to other provinces where people with disabilities are getting to keep more of the money that they earn if they're on income assistance or disability support program. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. We'll move to a remote screen, and you'll be able to see Henry, who's going to present for Newfoundland and Labrador.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to, I was going to say pleasure to see you, but I only see a couple of folks. But it's a pleasure to be here and be part of the conversation, so thank you very much for that. Relatively new to the role of Director of the Disability Policy Office. As Mary mentioned, she recently retired from that role, so filling big shoes, but very much enjoying my work there. So here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we've developed a 3-year action plan for inclusion called Access, Inclusion, and Equality. So that action plan really has been the result of a lot of tremendous collaboration and work, both within government and, more importantly, outside of government, with our community partners and people with, I guess, real people living real experiences. Not that bureaucrats aren't real people, we're kind of real, but more importantly, hearing the input from folks who have lived expertise in this area. So our action plan had 5 objectives, or has 5 objectives, and I'll mention those. None specifically mention employment, but they all in their own way support the idea of employment and really fuller inclusion in society. So the first is to build a positive image of disability, and we all know that attitudinal and systemic barriers exist, and this is really a fundamental piece that has to change in order for a lot of other pieces to change. Another objective is to engage persons with disabilities in decision-making. Certainly, collaboration and communicating with partners has been key throughout this process and in all of the work that we're doing. In particular, one example that's happening at the moment that's evolving, our Department of Justice and Public Safety is working with other government departments looking at the concept of supported decision-making legislation. So that's involved a lot of input from community partners and the public and a lot of other folks with expertise. We're also looking at another objective, increase accessibility of the built environment. Of course, that certainly supports the notion of employment in a couple of ways. One, certainly from a transportation perspective. If folks can't get to work, they can't do work. So that's an important piece. We're also undergoing in the province a thorough review of our Buildings Accessibility Act. So that's been a very thorough review of that act that's going to involve public consultations and some good discussion with the disability community in the province. And the fifth objective is to increase access to disability-related supports. And again, across government, because this is the effort of more than one department, it crosses all departments. Some of the ways that we're trying to do that is through offering different things like assistive technology programs, wage subsidies, similar to other jurisdictions. One thing I'll mention in particular that the Disability Policy Office is working on is the introduction of an individualized funding model. Right now that's starting in the realm of health, but that's going to expand across governments and services. So to really look at that one window, one point of access for folks. So it is certainly as I said, a team effort across government and community partners. Some of these programs and departments do collect some data, so we have some quantitative stuff and some baseline data, but there's really a move now lately to kind of pull that together, do a more consolidated analysis of that stuff, have better benchmarks, better data recording, and I guess more of the quantitative piece as well. So in terms of, and this is just a very quick overview, I'm aware of the time. In terms of the feedback on some of the draft national strategy, certainly feeling that the 4 pillars that have been identified align well with some of the work that we're doing. And I should mention actually some of the work that's evolving now in the province as we're moving from our action plan. We're actually looking at the development of, as Nova Scotia recently did and some other jurisdictions, developing an accessibility act or that piece of legislation. So our action plan, what we're finding is that action plan is very much becoming a foundational document for that, along, of course, with the UN Convention and the Canadian Charter. But it's almost like a stepping off or an evolving conversation that's happening in the province now as we're going to move into developing that legislation, and that's going to be very participatory. And we have a number of different groups throughout the province who will help that, including a provincial advisory council that gives advice to the minister. In terms of the national strategy, just a couple of observations. Again, very positive document, and it has a lot of strengths, and it's well written and reflects a lot of work across multiple jurisdictions. There may be an opportunity in there, I think, to make specific reference or frame this within the context of the convention and the charter. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, but it doesn't, so it might be nice to have that in there. Really like the fact that the document talks about employment as a right, and I think there might be an opportunity to even have stronger language in that regard. I struggle, and this is just myself, a couple of people have talked about the term disability confidence. I wonder how that relates to the idea of inclusion. I don't think it's necessarily redundant. So maybe disability confidence is part of the larger piece of inclusion, but just something to think about in terms of the language. And I think it would also be helpful if the draft strategy included some definitions, particularly of, for example, disability or barriers, just to make sure that we're really capturing the concept of cross-disability, visible and invisible, just to make sure that it's as comprehensive as possible. So I will stop there, and I think that's just about 6 minutes.
Just about is. Thank you very much, Henry. We'll move on to Brian.
Hi, Mary. Can you hear me there?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, hear you and see you.
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I would have really liked to have been there this week, but circumstances didn't really permit it, and that's okay. What I'd like to do is give you a bit of context. We've actually very recently concluded our employment action plan for persons with disabilities. We had an actual separate plan for employment as compared to the rest of the disability portfolio in New Brunswick. And the context that's important to understand that in New Brunswick, which is the same with most of the other Atlantic Canadian provinces, is that we have a rapidly aging population, which is driving our rate of disability very high. Just last week from the disability survey, the StatsCan survey, the rate of disability in New Brunswick was identified at being 26.7%, which is well over 1 in 4. What that means is that our disability rates are much higher than what we had been working with in terms of our original planning. We knew it was higher than what we'd been told before. It also means that in the province of New Brunswick, with our aging population, we've got some severe labor shortages in particular industries and opportunities out there. And at the same time, we have persons with disabilities who are not being very successful when they do get into the labor force, fully attaching to the labor force and getting that job that they really want. In the Employment Action Plan that New Brunswick crafted with stakeholders and others about 7 years ago, we did not have a baseline of information. It came from really kind of lived experience and input from a lot of stakeholders. So the original focus of that strategy 7 years ago was really transactional and kind of tactical in its nature. And what I mean by that is the organizations essentially, the service organizations essentially crafted a shopping list that they wanted the provincial government to perform with them and for them, with the notion that this would lead to better outcomes, theoretically, for persons with disabilities. But without a baseline, we had no real way of knowing that, whether that approach would be effective or not. Since that time, things have changed a little bit in New Brunswick. There's much more of a focus now on outcomes rather than inputs, which was our focus originally 7 years ago. So the outcome now that we're really focused on is basically how many people with disabilities are getting jobs. That's the only outcome we're looking at that really matters, real jobs with real incomes. And government has expressed that to us as well. There's also much more of a focus on collaboration, ongoing sector engagement through various structures and approaches, more desire to pursue evidence-based programs around what works to improve employment for persons with disabilities, and sector training. Our sector is quite small in New Brunswick. The key players you can probably put in a large conference room. That's one of our advantages, is that we're fairly nimble as a sector, as a group. We do have a baseline now that we've derived from a survey done through the New Brunswick Health Council and other sources at StatsCan, we know that in the province of New Brunswick, in any given month, there's about 30,000 unemployed persons. That would be persons in the labor force, ready, willing, and able to work, who cannot find employment. Of that 30,000, between 4,600 and 5,000 of those people would be a person with a disability. We know that that number has decreased somewhat in the last 2 or 3 years through the efforts of government and through the efforts of our employment activities and the fact that we have labor shortages, which would be driving some change. We're anticipating, we're hoping, we're expecting that the number of persons with disabilities in the labor force will be increasing over time, and that the number of persons with disabilities with jobs will be increasing in New Brunswick. For those that have been paying attention, we've had a change in government in the last 2 weeks. The government is instructing us and supporting the creation of a new strategy around employment for persons with disabilities, and we'll be pursuing that. And the word strategy is pretty important. We want to take an approach that's much more strategic in terms of our focus and much more concrete in the outcomes that we're going to be pursuing. In terms of the national strategy that you're working on, it's very consistent with the approach that we think would be very helpful in New Brunswick. We're particularly interested in the notion of looking at portability of programs and services based on the individual, and perhaps looking at some innovations that would be very supportive of literally putting the person at the center of whatever we're doing in a case-managed way, and then having that person, the person with the disability and the support network around that person, be able to purchase services or perhaps access those services as they see fit. We find that we've got some issues around gatekeeping, and it's difficult for an agency or a group of agencies to decide accurately what the demand for services will be 5 years from now. So we have to find some mechanisms, and perhaps market-driven mechanisms may be a way to do that, to be more nimble, to meet those needs of those individuals more readily, more quickly. One other point I wanted to make is the largest employers in most of the provinces, if not all of them, would be the provincial governments and the territorial governments themselves. And if a territorial or provincial or even the federal government does not have a strategy to hire and support persons with disabilities as an employer themselves, that might be a viable place to start. The provincial government of New Brunswick is making some changes now to enhance and support the initial hiring and then the support persons with disabilities who are part of their own existing labor force. It's difficult to go and ask the private sector themselves to hire and support an employment strategy for persons with disabilities as a government if the government themselves is not leading the way and articulating why that's an important thing to do. So I think my time might be up. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion the rest of the way.